Astrid Thorn, a fierce warrior daughter of the northern clans, who infiltrates the vanguard of the enemy to assassinate the man responsible for her people's starvation. Alpha King Draven Silverclaw. During a high-stakes siege on the Silverclaw Citadel, Astrid is captured after a grueling duel with Draven himself. When Draven forcefully unmasks his would-be assassin, he doesn't find a faceless monster but his fated mate. This discovery shatters his world. He is a king sworn to protect his pack from northern raiders, yet his soul now demands he protect the very woman who tried to slit his throat. Locked in a battle of wills within the palace walls, Astrid must confront the truth that her hatred was built on lies, while Draven must choose between the loyalty of his subjects and a bond that could either unite their warring lands or burn them both to the ground. The great hall of the Silverclaw Citadel was a cavern of suffocating heat and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Outside, the lunar festival had been transformed from a celebration of the moon's grace into a symphony of clashing steel and desperate screams. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, musky pheromones of agitated alphas. Astrid Thorn felt the weight of her stolen blackened steel armor as if it were made of lead, her lungs burning with every jagged breath. She had trained for this moment in the frozen silences of the Frostwood, where the wind whispered of her people's starvation and her father's voice was the only warmth she knew. Kill the king and the blight ends, he had promised. Now the king was less than 5 feet away, a towering shadow of lethal grace and golden-eyed fury. Draven Silverclaw moved like a storm made flesh. His great sword, a massive slab of silvered steel, hummed through the air, parrying Astrid's desperate thrusts with terrifying ease. She was fast, the fastest the northern clans had ever produced, but Draven was an alpha king. He didn't just fight, he dominated the very space around him. You move like a northern shadow, Draven growled, his voice a low vibration that rattled Astrid's teeth. He caught her wrist in a grip of iron, the heat of his skin searing through her leather gauntlets. But you bleed like a common mercenary. Who sent you to die in my hall? Astrid didn't answer. She twisted, using his momentum to drive a silver-dipped dagger toward the gap in his gorget. She was a weapon of ice, forged in the bitterness of a dying land, and she would not fail. The blade grazed his neck, drawing a thin line of crimson, but Draven didn't flinch. Instead, he let out a guttural snarl that shook the rafters. With a burst of explosive strength, he threw her back. Astrid hit the stone floor hard, the wind leaving her body in a pained wheeze. Before she could roll, he was over her, his heavy boot pinning her shoulder down while his hand reached for the visor of her helmet. Let's see the face of the coward who hides behind a dead man's steel, he spat. Draven gripped the edges of the helm. With a violent wrench, he tore the blackened metal away and tossed it aside. It clattered across the stones, the sound echoing like a death knell. Then the world stopped. The roar of the battle outside faded into a dull, distant hum. The flickering torchlight seemed to freeze in midair. The snarl that had been etched into Draven's face, a mask of pure, predatory hatred, began to crumble. His nostrils flared, taking in a scent that sliced through the smoke and blood. The smell of frozen pine needles, crushed mint, and something ancient, something that called to the very marrow of his bones. Astrid stared up at him, her chest heaving, her pale hair spilling across the dark stone like a crown of winter silk. She expected the killing blow. She braced for the cold bite of his sword. But the weight on her shoulder vanished. Draven's golden eyes widened, the pupils blowing out until his gaze was a dark, bottomless void. A violent shudder racked his massive frame. He stumbled back, his sword clattering to the floor, a sound that in any other moment would have signaled his defeat. His hand went to his chest, clutching at the leather over his heart as if something had just pierced him through. His breath hitched, turning into a broken, ragged gasp that carried a single impossible word. Mate. The word hit Astrid like a physical blow. The internal wolf she had spent years silencing with bitter herbs suddenly roared to life, shattering the chemical chains she had placed upon it. A searing heat erupted in her solar plexus, a golden thread of light snapping into place, binding her soul to the man who stood over her. The man she was meant to murder. Astrid's hand, still clutching the silver dagger, began to tremble. The hatred that had been her North Star for 19 years suddenly felt cold and hollow, eclipsed by a terrifying primal pull toward the enemy. She looked at Draven and saw not a tyrant but a mirror, a soul as jagged and lonely as her own, now illuminated by a bond that cared nothing for kingdoms, blights, or the blood on their hands. Draven reached out a hand, his fingers shaking, his gaze locked on her with a desperate, burgeoning hunger that threatened to consume them both. The Alpha King had unmasked his assassin, only to find the one person in all the world he was biologically incapable of killing. In the silence of the Great Hall, the war between their people was suddenly dwarfed by the war beginning in their hearts. The wind in the frostwood did not just blow, it mourned. It carried the scent of dry rot and the metallic tang of frozen earth that refused to yield life. Astrid Thorne stood at the edge of the clearing, her boots sinking into the gray, brittle snow. Before her lay the village of Oakhaven, or what was left of it. It was a place of skeletal trees and even more skeletal people, a testament to the slow, agonizing starvation that had gripped the northern clans for 3 long years. She watched as a young woman, hardly older than Astrid herself, sat huddled against the base of a dying pine. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in frayed wool. The child was silent, a silence more terrifying than any scream. Astrid stepped closer, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw the boy's face, pale as the hoarfrost, his skin pulled taut over delicate bones. His eyes were open, staring at a sky that offered no mercy, and then with one final shuddering exhale that looked like a puff of smoke in the frigid air, the light in them went out. The mother did not weep. She simply leaned her forehead against the child's cold brow and closed her eyes. She had no tears left. The blight had taken those too. Look at them, Astrid. The voice was like grinding stones. Astrid turned to see her father, Silas Thorne, standing behind her. His cloak was trimmed with the mangy fur of a wolf that had died of the same hunger. His eyes, once a vibrant blue, were now clouded with a bitter, simmering darkness. He gestured toward the village with a hand that trembled, not from cold, but from a lifetime of concentrated rage. Every day the Silverclaw kingdom grows fatter while we wither, Silas rasped, stepping toward the grieving mother. Draven Silverclaw sits in his citadel of stone, drinking wine from golden cups, while he chokes the life out of our soil with his dark expansion. He has diverted the springs, he has cursed the migration paths, and he watches from his high tower as our children turn to dust. Astrid felt the heat rising in her chest, a fierce, protective fire that burned hotter than the winter frost. She looked back at the dead child, and the grief she felt was instantly swallowed by a black, oily tide of hatred. She had been raised on these stories of the Alpha King's greed, of his father's cruelty, and of the inherent evil of the Silverclaw pack. To her, Draven Silverclaw was not a man. He was a monster, a parasite feeding on the lifeblood of the North. He will pay for this, Astrid whispered, her voice cracking. We should march. We should tear down his gates. An army would be slaughtered before they reached the outer walls, Silas said, turning to look his daughter in the eye. He placed his heavy hands on her shoulders, his grip bordering on painful. A wolf does not attack a bare head-on, Astrid. It waits. It hides. It strikes the throat when the beast thinks itself safest. You are the fastest, the deadliest of us. You have the spirit of the Old North in your veins. He reached into the folds of his cloak and pulled out a long, narrow bundle wrapped in oilskin. He unwrapped it to reveal a dagger of shimmering silver, its hilt carved into the likeness of a snarling wolf. This was your mother's. It has been dipped in the waters of the Moonwell. It is the only thing that can pierce an Alpha King's hide and stay the heart within. Astrid reached out, her fingers brushing the cold metal. As she took the weapon, a heavy sense of destiny settled over her. She thought of the child's empty eyes. She thought of the silence in the woods where there should have been the sound of prey. Her wolf, usually a restless presence in the back of her mind, went still and cold, aligning with her singular purpose. I will go, Astrid said, her voice now steady and hard as the ice on the Great Lake. I will cross the border. I will find him in his den of thieves. Silas leaned down, his forehead pressing against hers. Bring me his head, Astrid. Bring it back to the frostwood and we will plant it in this gray earth. Only then will the blight lift. Only then will our people breathe again. I swear it, father, Astrid vowed, her hand tightening around the silver hilt until her knuckles turned white. By the blood of the North and the silence of this forest, Draven Silverclaw will die by my hand. She didn't look back at the village or the mother who still held her ghost of a son. She turned toward the south, where the peaks of the Silverclaw Mountains pierced the horizon like jagged teeth. Behind her, the wind howled louder, no longer mourning but screaming for blood. The hunt had begun. The border of the Silverclaw Kingdom was not a line on a map. It was a living, breathing barrier of iron and tooth. Astrid moved through the twilight of the transition zone, where the sickly, twisted pines of the Frostwood began to give way to the towering, healthy oaks of the south. The contrast was a bitter pill to swallow. Here the air tasted of rich loam and vitality, a cruel mockery of the dust and rot she had left behind. She found her target near a secluded waypoint station, a stone outpost that smelled of roasted meat and wet fur. A Silverclaw scout, separated from his unit to relieve himself in the brush, became the unwilling key to her infiltration. He was large, smelling of the Alpha King's prosperity, and he never saw the shadow that detached itself from the trees. Astrid did not use her mother's silver blade, that was reserved for a royal heart. Instead, she used a heavy stone and the efficiency of a predator. Dragging the unconscious man into the hollow of a rotted log, she began the grim task of stripping him. The armor was high-quality steel, etched with the sigil of a snarling wolf's head. It was warm from his body, a heat that made her skin crawl with the reminder of his humanity, but she suppressed the feeling. She dyed her hair with the crushed berries of a nightshade bush, turning her conspicuous northern silver into a dull, muddy brown, and bound her chest tight with strips of linen to hide the curves that would betray her. As she strapped the greaves onto her legs, she felt the weight of the mercenary's shadow. To the world, she was no longer Astrid Thorne. She was a faceless grunt in the Silverclaw war machine. The infiltration began at the Blackwood Crossing. The bridge was a massive structure of timber and stone, guarded by a dozen soldiers and a pair of sentry wolves, beasts the size of ponies with eyes that glowed like embers. Astrid kept her head down, her visor lowered just enough to obscure her eyes but not enough to look suspicious. She joined a supply caravan, blending into the soot-stained ranks of mercenaries and sellswords following the tail of the army. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the low rhythmic thrum of shifted wolves communicating in the distance. Just as she reached the midpoint of the crossing, the caravan halted. "Hold. Alpha's scent check," a commander shouted. Astrid's heart seized. A sniffing patrol, 3 werewolves in their midshift forms, elongated snouts and tufted ears, began weaving through the line of soldiers. They weren't looking for faces, they were looking for the wrong pheromones. The herbal suppressants she had swallowed were bitter on her tongue, but they were supposed to mask her northern scent, making her smell like nothing more than cold steel and sweat. One of the patrol wolves, a scarred brute with a notched ear, stopped directly in front of her. He leaned in, his wet nose twitching violently as he inhaled at the gap in her gorget. Astrid held her breath, her hand resting instinctively on the hilt of her hidden dagger. The wolf let out a low, rumbling growl, his hackles rising. He sensed something, a flicker of the ice-cold frostwood beneath the mask of mercenary grime. The brute bared his yellowed fangs, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to let out the howl that would end her mission before it truly began. Astrid stared straight ahead, focusing on the rhythmic beat of her own heart, willing her inner wolf to remain a silent, frozen ghost. "Move it along, Bark-Eater," a passing sergeant barked, slapping the side of the wolf's flank with a leather gauntlet. "The king wants these supplies at the citadel by moonrise. We don't have time for you to flirt with the new recruits." The sentry wolf huffed, a puff of hot, meaty breath hitting Astrid's visor. He shot her one last suspicious glance before moving to the next soldier in line. Astrid didn't exhale until the caravan began to move again. She walked forward, her boots heavy on the stone, each step taking her further from the home she was trying to save and closer to the king she was sworn to kill. The shadows of the Silverclaw Mountains loomed ahead, jagged and dark against the rising moon, welcoming her into the belly of the beast. The Silverclaw Citadel breathed with a decadent, predatory life during the lunar festival. The air in the great hall was a thick tapestry of roasted stag, expensive wine, and the underlying scent of 1,000 wolves gathered under one roof. Drifting through the peripheral shadows, Astrid felt the oppressive heat of the roaring hearths. To the Silverclaw pack, this was a night of sacred triumph. To her, it was the final hour of a death sentence. High above the revelry, the moon hung full and bloated, casting beams through the clerestory windows that silvered the floor like blades. Astrid's stolen armor felt like a second skin now, though the weight of the hidden dagger against her thigh was all she could focus on. She moved with the calculated invisibility of a servant, weaving past drunken high-ranking alphas who laughed with the thunder of men who had never known a day of hunger. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne carved from the obsidian heart of the mountain, was Draven Silverclaw. He was more imposing than the stories had promised. His dark hair was swept back from a face of sharp regal angles, and his presence felt like a physical weight pressing against the room. He didn't look like a man who enjoyed the feast. His golden eyes moved with the restless energy of a hawk, scanning his subjects with a gaze that saw too much. Beside him, his generals toasted to the subjugation of the north, their voices rising in a boisterous cheer that sent a fresh jolt of venom through Astrid's veins. She waited for the moment the musicians struck up a heavy rhythmic beat on the skin drums, the sound vibrating through the stone floor and masking the subtle sounds of movement. As the guests stood to howl their salute to the moon, Astrid slipped behind a tapestry of the founding packs and emerged in the narrow corridor leading to the dais. He did not hesitate. She did not breathe. She lunged from the shadows, a streak of blackened steel. The silver-dipped dagger was out, a sliver of moonlight held in her hand, aimed unerringly at the pulse beating in Draven's throat. The Alpha King did not turn, he reacted. With a speed that defied his massive frame, he spun in his throne, his hand snapping up to catch her forearm. The impact was like striking a stone wall. The force of his grip threatened to shatter her radius, but Astrid used the momentum to vault over his arm, her boot catching him in the chest to create distance. "Assassin!" a general roared, but Draven raised a hand, silencing the room even as he stood. His golden eyes were fixed on the masked figure before him, flashing with a terrifying dark amusement. "Stay back," Draven commanded, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that made the wine in the cups tremble. "This one has been stalking me since the Blackwood crossing. I want to see what the North has sent to die tonight." Astrid didn't speak. She couldn't. If she opened her mouth, the frantic, high-pitched scent of her fear might leak through the suppressants. She circled him, her movements fluid and desperate. She struck again, a flurry of blows that Draven parried with his bare forearms, the steel of her gauntlets clashing against his skin with the sound of a blacksmith's hammer. He was playing with her. He moved with a lazy, terrifying grace, dodging her strikes by mere inches, letting her exhaust herself against his superior strength. Every time she got close, he repelled her with a blow that felt like a falling tree. "You fight with the bitterness of a winter storm," Draven taunted, his hand suddenly shooting out to catch the front of her cuirass. He yanked her forward, bringing her face inches from his. "But storms eventually blow out." Astrid snarled, a sound that was half human and half wolf, and drove her knee into his midsection. The blow landed, forcing a grunt of pain from him, and for a second his grip loosened. She slashed upward, the silver blade cutting a thin, burning line across his cheek. The humor vanished from Draven's face. His eyes bled into a solid, molten gold, and the air around him began to distort with the sheer pressure of his alpha aura. It was a weight that forced the other wolves in the room to drop to their knees, and it nearly buckled Astrid's legs. He lunged. This time there was no grace, only the raw, unchecked power of a predator. He caught her in midair as she tried to tumble away, slamming her back against the obsidian throne. The impact cracked the stone and sent a white-hot bloom of agony through her spine. Before she could recover, his massive hand closed around her throat, pinning her to the seat of his power. "No more games," he growled, the sound vibrating through her very bones. His other hand reached for her helmet. Astrid thrashed, her fingers clawing at his arm, but it was like trying to move a mountain. With a violent, predatory wrench, Draven tore the helmet from her head. The metal clattered to the floor, the sound ringing out in the suddenly silent hall. Astrid's hair, darkened by nightshade but still shimmering with a ghostly northern luster, fell around her shoulders in a tangled web. Her face was flushed, her lips parted in a desperate gasp for air, her wide, icy blue eyes fixed on his in a look of defiant, murderous hatred. Draven's hand tightened on her throat for a fraction of a second, his snarl deepening, and then he froze. The scent hit him. It wasn't the smell of a mercenary or a spy. It was the scent of the first frost on a bed of mountain wildflowers. It was the scent of the missing half of his soul. Draven's pupils dilated until his eyes were twin pools of black ink. The hand at her throat didn't let go, but the pressure changed from a stranglehold to a trembling, frantic touch. His breath hitched in his chest, a jagged, broken sound that echoed in the silence of the hall. The great hall, the generals, the war, the north, it all vanished. There was only the girl pinned against his throne and the violent, golden heat of the mate bond slamming into him with the force of a tidal wave. Mate, Draven whispered, the word a shattered prayer. Astrid's dagger fell from her nerveless fingers, clashing against the stone, as her own wolf finally broke through the darkness, recognizing the monster as its master. Under the light of the full moon, the enemy had found his queen, and the world began to burn. Of herbs, was now a frantic, pacing presence in her mind. It didn't care about the starving children in the north. It didn't care about the silver dagger she had used to cut the king's cheek. It only wanted to howl, to submit, to press its neck against the alpha's pulse and stay there until the world ended. Astrid gripped the edge of a mahogany table until her knuckles turned white. He is the enemy, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He is the reason for the rot. He is a murderer. But as the words left her lips, her body betrayed her. A wave of phantom heat washed over her skin, carrying the scent of cedar and mountain air, Draven's scent. It settled in her lungs, making her lightheaded. Her skin ached with a sudden localized sensitivity, craving the touch of the hand that had pinned her to the throne. She remembered the way his eyes had shifted from predatory gold to a soft, shattered amber the moment the mask fell. A soft click echoed through the room. The door swung open and the atmosphere changed instantly. The air became charged, thick with the scent of an alpha in distress. Draven stepped inside. He had removed his heavy ceremonial armor, wearing only a black tunic that strained against the muscles of his shoulders. The cut on his cheek had already begun to scab over, a dark line against his tan skin. He didn't approach her. He stayed by the door, his hands clenched at his sides as if he were fighting the same invisible tether. "You haven't eaten," he said. His voice was no longer the thunder of the great hall. It was a low, gravelly vibration that sent a treacherous shiver down Astrid's spine. "I don't eat the bread of tyrants," Astrid snapped, though her voice lacked its usual lethal edge. She backed away until her spine hit the cold stone of the far wall. "Why am I here, Draven? Why am I not in the iron pits with the rest of the spies?" Draven took a single step forward. The movement was predatory yet hesitant. "You know why. You felt it the moment I touched you. The Moon Mother doesn't care about our borders or our blood feuds." "The Moon Mother is cruel then," Astrid hissed. She felt the urge to shift, to let the fur sprout and the claws grow, not to fight him, but to rub against him in a display of primal recognition. She bit her lip until she tasted copper, using the pain to ground herself in her hatred. "My people are dying because of your greed. You think a biological trick is going to make me forget the smell of a child's funeral pyre?" Draven's expression darkened, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his features. "Greed? Astrid, I have sent 3 caravans of grain to the northern pass in the last month alone. None of them returned. My scouts say the north is preparing for a total invasion, using the blight as a fabrication for war." "Liar!" Astrid screamed, lunging forward. She didn't have her dagger, but she had her rage. She reached him in a blur of movement, her fists striking his chest. But the moment her skin made contact with his, the fight died. It was like a circuit completing. A jolt of pure, ecstatic electricity shot through her arms, sinking into her heart and grounding her soul. Her gasping breath hitched. Instead of pushing him away, her fingers curled into the fabric of his tunic, pulling him closer. Draven groaned, a sound of deep, agonizing relief. He wrapped his massive arms around her, lifting her nearly off her feet. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling sharply. I can't kill you," he whispered against her skin, his breath hot and frantic. "I should execute you for what you tried to do, but my wolf would rip my own heart out before I could draw the blade." Astrid's head fell back, her eyes fluttering shut. The primal pull was winning. Every cell in her body sang a song of homecoming. She hated him, she had to hate him, but as he pressed her against the door, his heart thumping in a wild, syncopated rhythm against her own, the northern princess felt her resolve melting like spring ice. She was a weapon that had finally found its sheath, and the terrifying truth was that she didn't want to be a weapon anymore. He just wanted to be his. The morning sun filtered through the high, arched windows of the citadel, but it brought no warmth to the tension that sat between them like a whetted blade. Astrid followed 3 paces behind Draven, her hands still tingling from the phantom heat of their touch the night before. She watched the way he moved, not with the arrogant strut of a conqueror, but with a heavy, purposeful gait that suggested the crown was a burden of lead rather than gold. She kept her jaw tight, her mind a battlefield where the primal urges of her wolf fought a losing war against the indoctrinated hatred of her upbringing. They descended into the belly of the fortress, leaving behind the silken tapestries of the royal quarters for the cool, damp air of the subterranean levels. The scent of stone and ancient dust gave way to something else, something that made Astrid's stomach turn in a traitorous knot of hunger. It was the smell of life. It was the dry, sweet aroma of cured hay and the earthy richness of stored grain. Draven stopped before a set of massive iron-bound doors. 2 guards straightened, their eyes widening as they recognized the woman who had nearly ended their king's life, but a single sharp look from Draven silenced any protest. He heaved the doors open himself, the hinges groaning under the weight. "You call me a thief, Astrid Thorn," Draven said, his voice echoing in the vast vaulted chamber. "You say I have fattened my pack on the marrow of your children. Look." Astrid stepped into the room and for a moment she forgot how to breathe. The storehouse was cavernous, filled from floor to ceiling with burlap sacks and wooden crates. There was enough wheat, barley and rye here to feed the entire Silverclaw kingdom for 3 winters. But it wasn't the abundance that shocked her, it was the state of the supplies. She walked to the nearest crate, prying the lid open with trembling fingers. Inside lay apples, but they were shriveled, spotted with a black oily fungus that looked disturbingly familiar. She moved to a sack of grain and sliced it open with her fingernail. The golden seeds spilled out, but as they hit the light she saw the same dark wrought webbing through the pile. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The blight. You have it too." "The blight did not start in the north, Astrid," Draven said, standing behind her, his presence a wall of heat at her back. "It started here in the heart of my valleys 4 years ago. I didn't divert your springs. I didn't curse your migration paths. I have been burning my own fields to keep this rot from spreading, while my people eat rations that are half spoiled." He walked to a heavy oak desk in the corner of the room and pulled out a series of ledgers, tossing them onto a crate before her. "These are the manifest. For 2 years I have sent relief caravans to the Frostwood border. My scouts reported that they were received by your father's commanders. I thought the north was recovering. I thought the peace was being bought with Silverclaw gold and grain." Astrid flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the dates and the seal of the northern clans, her father's seal. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of pounds of grain, medicine and livestock had been signed for. "This is impossible," she breathed, the world tilting beneath her feet. "We saw nothing. Not a single wagon. My father told us the caravans were ambushed by your raiders. He showed us the scorched remains of the wagons at the border. I have lost over 50 men guarding those caravans, Astrid," Draven said, his golden eyes burning with a weary, honest pain. "Men who died thinking they were bringing bread to starving neighbors. If your people never saw that grain, it wasn't because I didn't send it. It was because someone stopped it before it reached the villages." Astrid leaned against a stack of crates, the damp chill of the storehouse finally seeping into her bones. The walls of her past, the stories of the greedy Alpha King, the righteous suffering of the North, the absolute villainy of the Silverclaw name, were cracking. If Draven wasn't the monster, then the man who had placed the silver dagger in her hand was. She looked at Draven, really looked at him, and saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He wasn't the gluttonous tyrant of her father's legends. He was a man fighting a losing battle against a silent enemy, a king who had been trying to save her people while she was being trained to slit his throat. "He lied to me," she whispered, the realization cutting deeper than any blade. "He let them die. He let the children die just to keep the hatred alive." Draven reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder before finally coming to rest with a gentle, grounding weight. "The bond doesn't just link our hearts, Astrid. It links our truths. My wolf knows yours is hurting. We have been fighting a war fueled by ghosts and shadows." Astrid didn't pull away. For the first time, the pull of the mate bond didn't feel like a surrender. It felt like a sanctuary. She turned toward him, the rot of the grain surrounding them a grim reminder of the stakes. The enemy wasn't across the border. The enemy was in the blood, in the lies, and in the very home she had sworn to protect. The chill of the storehouse followed Astrid as she and Draven ascended to the Citadel's restricted archives, a place where the air felt thick with the dust of centuries and the weight of uncomfortable truths. The silence here was different from the silence of the Frostwood. It was the silence of secrets waiting to be exhumed. Draven moved with a grim focus, his golden eyes scanning the high shelves of leather-bound ledgers and wax-sealed scrolls until he found a cedar box marked with the seal of the Neutral Trade Guild. "I intercepted this from a courier 3 months ago," Draven said, his voice low and tight. "I couldn't make sense of it then. I thought it was a forgery meant to sow discord within my own ranks. But after what you told me about the caravans..." He set the box on a heavy oak table and broke the seal. Inside lay a single vellum scroll, yellowed and smelling of old smoke. Astrid's breath caught in her throat as she saw the crest at the top, the twin wolves of the northern clans. Her father's crest. With trembling fingers she unrolled the parchment. Her eyes darted across the elegant, sloping script, but the words felt like jagged glass in her mind. It was a formal agreement, a pact between Silas Thorne and a shadowy consortium of black market merchants. The terms were cold, calculated, and monstrous. The pact detailed the systematic diversion of the Silverclaw relief caravans. It wasn't just that the grain was being stolen. It was being sold to foreign territories in the east to fund the purchase of forbidden dark steel weaponry. But the most devastating clause was written in her father's own hand at the bottom of the page. The scarcity must be absolute. The hunger of the lower clans is the only fire hot enough to forge a vanguard. Without a common enemy and a desperate cause, the North will never unify under my total command. Let them starve until they beg for the blood of Silverclaw. Below the text sat the signature, unmistakable in its bold, arrogant strokes. Silas Thorne, High Alpha of the North. Astrid felt a coldness spread through her that had nothing to do with the winter air. The world she had lived in, the reality of her father's righteousness and the Alpha King's villainy, disintegrated completely. Every memory of a hungry child, every funeral pyre she had wept over, and every drop of blood she had spilled in training was nothing more than a brick in a wall built by her father's ambition. He hadn't just watched his people die, he had curated their deaths to turn his daughter into a weapon. "He knew," she whispered, her voice a hollow rasp. "He knew the blight was a natural disaster we could have survived together. He turned it into a weapon to ensure a war he could profit from." Draven moved toward her, the heat of his presence grounding her as the floor seemed to fall away. "He didn't just want a war, Astrid. He wanted a martyr. If you had succeeded in killing me, you would have died in this hall, and the North would have burned in a frenzy of vengeance that would have given him total power over both kingdoms." Astrid looked up at him, her icy blue eyes swimming with tears of pure, molten rage. The mate bond which she had fought so hard to suppress, now flared with a protective, fierce intensity. She reached out, her hand finding Draven's, and this time she didn't just accept the touch, she craved it. The man she had been sent to assassinate was the only person who had ever shown her the truth. "I was a fool," she said, her voice hardening. "I carried a blade for a monster thinking I was serving a saint." "You were a daughter who loved her people," Draven corrected gently, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "He used that love. But the bond between us, he couldn't have planned for that. It's the one thing he can't control." Astrid turned back to the scroll, the ink of her father's signature looking like dried blood. She realized now that her mission hadn't failed. It had simply changed. She was no longer an assassin sent to kill a king. She was a witness, a survivor, and the only person who could stop the North from marching into a slaughterhouse built on lies. The silver dagger was still in the king's possession, but Astrid realized she didn't need it. She had the truth, and in the war to come, it would be the deadliest weapon of all. The heavy silence of the archive was shattered by the rhythmic, thunderous beating of fists against the great hall's doors below. The sound echoed up the spiral stone stairs, a primal drumbeat of a pack demanding blood. Astrid stood frozen, the incriminating scroll still clutched in her hand, but her focus was entirely on the man standing before her. Draven's jaw was set so tight the muscle leaped in his cheek. He could hear what she could not, the low harmonic growls of hundreds of wolves whose instincts were screaming for the death of the northern assassin. "They won't wait much longer," Draven said, his voice a low vibration of warning. He reached out, his hand wrapping around her wrist, not to restrain her but to pull her toward the light. "My council, my generals, they saw you strike at me. In their eyes, you are a parasite that must be purged to keep the kingdom's blood pure." "Then let them try," Astrid whispered, her northern pride flaring even through the shock of her father's betrayal. "I am a warrior of the Frostwood. I won't beg for mercy from those who think I am a trophy." Draven pulled her closer, his golden eyes burning with a desperate, fierce light. "I'm not asking you to beg. I'm asking you to survive. There is only one law older than the pack's right to vengeance, Astrid. The law of the mate." He led her out of the archive and down into the gallery overlooking the great hall. Below, the scene was a sea of shifting shadows and bared fangs. Hundreds of Silverclaw soldiers and high-ranking alphas had gathered, their collective aura creating a pressure so thick the air felt like liquid lead. At the center stood General Kale, Draven's most trusted advisor, his face twisted into a mask of righteous fury. "Bring out the assassin, Draven." Kale's voice boomed, shaking the tapestries. "The law is clear. Blood for blood." She tried to take the life of the king. "The pack demands her head on the battlements before the moon sets." A roar of agreement surged through the hall, a terrifying sound of unified bloodlust. Astrid felt her inner wolf recoil, not in fear, but in the instinctive realization of being the prey in a room full of apex predators. Draven stepped onto the balcony, pulling Astrid beside him. The roar died down into a low, menacing hiss of whispers. He didn't look at his people as a supplicant, he looked at them as their sovereign. He placed a heavy hand on Astrid's shoulder, a gesture of protection that sent a shockwave of disbelief through the crowd. "This woman is no longer a prisoner of war," Draven announced, his voice carrying the weight of a mountain. "She is the missing half of my soul. The Moon Mother has spoken. Astrid Thorn is my fated mate." For a heartbeat the silence was absolute. Then a cacophony of outrage erupted. "Lies!" Kale screamed, his eyes bleeding to a dark, mutinous red. "A northern spy? A daughter of the man who starves our borders? You would choose a murderer over your own kin? She has bewitched you with northern sorcery." "It is no sorcery, Kale," Draven roared back, his alpha presence exploding outward, forcing the front ranks of the crowd to buckle. "It is the bond. And I will not shed the blood of my mate to appease your fear." "If you won't kill her, we will," a voice shouted from the back. A soldier lunged toward the stairs and the hall descended into chaos. The line between loyalty and mutiny vanished in a heartbeat. Draven turned to Astrid, his movements frantic. He knew he couldn't fight his entire pack without losing his throne, and he couldn't protect her through words alone. He grabbed the front of her tunic, his eyes searching hers with a silent plea. "Forgive me," he breathed. Before Astrid could ask why, Draven tilted her head back. His fangs elongated, gleaming white in the torchlight. He didn't hesitate. He sank his teeth into the sensitive junction where her neck met her shoulder. Astrid gasped, her back arching as a white-hot explosion of sensation flooded her nervous system. It wasn't the pain of a wound. It was the searing, permanent brand of a king. The marking. It was a claim that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the blood of every wolf in the room. A golden light seemed to pulse from the bite, a physical manifestation of the bond being sealed in the eyes of the pack. Astrid slumped against him, her breath coming in ragged sobs as the chemical rush of the marking hit her brain. She was now part of him and he was part of her. Her scent changed instantly, the northern ice now laced with the unmistakable dominant musk of the Silverclaw Alpha. Below, the mutiny faltered, but it did not die. The soldiers stopped their advance, paralyzed by the sacrilege and the sanctity of what they had just witnessed. General Kale looked up, his face pale with a cold, simmering hatred. He didn't bow. He didn't submit. "You have marked our enemy," Kale whispered, the sound carrying through the stunned silence. "You have chosen a girl over your kingdom. You are no longer our king, Draven. You are a traitor to the Silverclaw blood." Kale turned to the soldiers, his hand rising. "To the armory. If the Alpha King has fallen to the north, then we shall lead ourselves." As the pack began to splinter and turn on itself, Draven held Astrid tight, his heart thundering against her marked shoulder. He had saved her life, but in doing so he had started a civil war. The citadel was no longer a fortress. It was a tinderbox, and the flame was his love for the woman who had come to kill him. The chaos within the citadel walls was silenced by a sound far more terrifying than the shouts of mutiny. The low rhythmic thrum of war horns echoing from the frostwood. The siege of shadows had begun. Astrid stood on the balcony, her neck still pulsing with the heat of Draven's mark, as she watched the tree line bleed into a black tide of northern warriors. These were not the starving villagers she had left behind. These were the elite shadows of her father's guard, their armor slick with the dark steel he had purchased with the lives of his own people. Draven's hand found hers, his grip a grounding force amidst the madness. "They aren't here for a rescue," he whispered, his golden eyes scanning the horizon. "Your father is here to erase his mistakes. He knows you've seen the truth." The Silverclaw citadel, already fractured by General Kale's descent, struggled to mount a defense. The north moved with a spectral efficiency, using smoke and ancient wolf magic to scale the walls. Astrid felt a wrenching agony in her chest as she saw the twin wolf banners unfurl. Her wolf howled in her mind, a sound of mourning for a home that had been a lie. Suddenly the balcony doors behind them shattered. Silas Thorne stepped into the light, his eyes cold and devoid of the fatherly warmth he had once used to manipulate her. He held a jagged long sword that hummed with a sickly purple light, the dark steel of the eastern markets. "Astrid," he said, his voice as sharp as the winter wind. "You've spent too much time in the sun. It has softened your mind. Step away from the beast and return to your kin. We can still tell the story of how you were held captive and forced into this branding." "I saw the ledgers, father," Astrid said, her voice trembling but her gaze held steady. "I saw your signature on the famine. I saw the price you put on the children of Oakhaven." Silas didn't flinch. He didn't offer a denial. He simply smiled, a thin, cruel line. "A few must wither so the pack can lead. You were meant to be the spark that lit the fire of the Great War, Astrid. If you won't be a martyr, you are merely an obstacle." He lunged not at Astrid but at Draven. The Alpha King met him with a roar, his own sword clashing against the dark steel in a shower of sparks. The air became a vortex of alpha pressure, the weight of two kings battling for the soul of the north and south. Astrid watched as Draven fought with a desperate, self-sacrificing ferocity. He wasn't just fighting for his kingdom. He was shielding her body with his own, taking shallow cuts from Silas's blade to ensure she remained untouched. He was the man she had been told was a monster, yet he was the only one willing to die for her truth. "Astrid, end this," Silas roared as he parried a heavy blow from Draven. "Kill him now and the North will forgive your hesitation. Choose your blood." The world seemed to slow. Astrid looked at her father, the man who had forged her into a weapon of hate. Then she looked at Draven, the mate who had marked her to save her life, the man whose soul was now intertwined with her own. The choice was a jagged blade in her heart, but as her wolf surged to the surface, the ice of the frostwood finally melted. "I am choosing my blood," Astrid cried out, her voice a clarion call that cut through the sounds of battle. "But not the blood you share with me, father. I am choosing the blood of the people you betrayed." For the first time in years, Astrid didn't suppress her shift. She didn't use herbs to hide her scent. She let the power of the mate bond explode through her limbs. Her bones cracked and reshaped in a blur of silver fur and raw power. She was no longer a girl with a dagger. She was a white wolf of the north, larger and more radiant than any her father had ever seen. He didn't hesitate. She leapt, a streak of moonlight, and collided with Silas just as he raised his dark steel blade for a killing stroke against a wounded Draven. They tumbled across the stone floor, a tangle of teeth and steel. As Silas looked into the eyes of his daughter, eyes that were no longer blue but a fierce, regal gold, he saw the end of his ambition. Astrid pinned him down, her growl a vibration that shook the very foundation of the citadel. She didn't kill him, she stripped him of his sword and his dignity, holding him for the justice of the combined packs. Outside, the northern warriors slowed their assault, sensing the shift in the alpha power. The siege of shadows was breaking. Astrid stood over her fallen father, her fur stained with the dust of the citadel, and turned to Draven. The Alpha King dragged himself to his feet, his gaze locked on her with a devotion that transcended the war. In the ruins of the balcony, amidst the smoke of a dying era, the choice was finally made. She was no longer a shadow of the Frostwood. She was the light of a new kingdom. The heavy, sulphurous smoke of the siege slowly dissipated, carried away by a cleansing wind that swept down from the high peaks. The citadel was silent, though it was not the silence of the grave, but the hushed, breathless stillness of a world that had just survived a cataclysm. On the high ramparts, where the stone was still scorched by magical fire and chipped by northern steel, Astrid and Draven stood side by side. Astrid had shifted back, draped now in a heavy cloak of silver-claw crimson that Draven had fastened around her shoulders with trembling hands. The mark on her neck felt like a living coal, humming with a steady rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of Draven's heart. Below them, the great courtyard was a sea of upturned faces. The Silverclaw soldiers, once mutinous and bloodthirsty, stood in uneasy formation alongside the northern warriors who had laid down their dark steel blades. The transition of power had been swift and jagged. With Silas Thorne stripped of his title and led away in chains to face the judgment of the elders, the northern vanguard had faltered, then knelt. They had seen their traitor princess transform into a creature of legend, and they had felt the undeniable authority of the mate bond radiating from the battlements. Draven stepped forward, his hand finding Astrid's and interlacing their fingers. The contact sent a wave of calm through the courtyard, a literal cooling of the ambient alpha aggression that had fueled the war for generations. The cycle of blood ends today. Draven's voice rang out, projected by the strength of his lungs and the weight of his conviction. For years we were fed a diet of shadow and lies. We were told the North was our parasite and the North was told we were their executioners. But the Blight did not choose sides and neither shall our future. Astrid stepped up beside him, her gaze sweeping over the northern clansmen. She saw the faces of men she had trained with, men who had lost sisters and sons to the famine her father had orchestrated. I am a daughter of the Frostwood, she called out, her voice clear and carrying the resonance of a true Luna. And I have seen the grain rotting in the Silverclaw cellars just as it rotted in our fields. We were played against one another so that a man who loved power more than his people could thrive. That man is gone. Today we do not surrender to Fenrath or to the south. We surrender to the truth. She raised their joined hands high, the moonlight catching the silver of the mark on her neck and the gold in Draven's eyes. From this moment there is no north or south. There is only the pack of the two wolves. Our grain will be shared. Our medicine will be shared. And our blood will no longer be spilled by the hands of our brothers. A low, rumbling sound began in the back of the crowd. It wasn't a growl of anger but a rhythmic vibration of approval. One by one the wolves began to howl, not the piercing cry of war but a long melodic note of union. The sound rose from the courtyard, echoing off the mountain peaks and carrying all the way back to the Frostwood, signaling to the starving and the weary that the long winter of the soul was over. Draven turned to Astrid, pulling her into the circle of his arms. The high-tension drama of the last few days seemed to melt away, leaving only the quiet, profound reality of their bond. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "A kingdom reborn," he whispered, his eyes soft with a wonder he had never permitted himself before. "It will be a difficult path, Astrid. The hatred won't vanish overnight." "No," Astrid agreed, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, lingering on the healing scar she had given him. "But we have the truth. And we have the bond. For the first time in 19 years I'm not fighting for a ghost. I'm living for a future." They stood together on the ramparts as the first light of a new dawn began to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray snow of the border into a field of shimmering gold. The war was over. The assassin had found her king, the king had found his heart, and the two wolves of legend were finally, peacefully won.